Hello everyone. Today Marius, Megan, Paul and I will guide you through a sequence of logical steps that we hope will facilitate your group projects and in fact any modeling endeavor you might have in the future. So you already know Megan and myself. Let me briefly introduce Marius and Paul to you. Marius is a research associate at York University in Toronto, and he works on modal learning and visual perception. He's also a former Cosmo participant. He's originally Dutch, only dances with his daughters, tries to run every weekend, and likes things like salty chips, superheroes, sci-fi, and fantasy. Paul is a professor in computer science and psychology at the University of Minnesota. He does research in AI, computational cognitive science, machine learning, and all of that. And he is a co-organizer of the Cosmos Summer School and a popularizer of a rational approach to modeling. Paul is curiouser and curiouser, apparently. His intelligence is artificial, and he enjoys COVID-cancelled things like travel, busy restaurants, group fitness, and things like that. Okay, so as Megan has already shown you earlier, modeling can be decomposed into 10 steps. So today we will focus on the first 5 because they set you up the right way to achieve your goals. So we will first talk about steps 1 and 2 involving describing the phenomenon of interest, asking questions and defining a goal, and also doing the literature review. Then we will talk about the step 3, which is essentially thinking about the ingredients you will need for your model, and step 4, which is the specification of hypotheses. And we will end with a brief outline of step 5, which is then the toolkit selection, how you will actually do the modeling. Now, the goal here is really to focus on steps 1 to 4. Those are the trickiest ones typically, and we will illustrate those steps using a particular phenomenon called the train illusion that I will introduce, for which there's currently no model. And we will essentially try to convey the way that these things work, or the way that the thought process works, by doing some role play, so that you can essentially get a feeling of what it entails, and also learn from some of the pitfalls that we will present. And I want to emphasize and remind you that the projects are about learning the procedure, not about building a perfect model. So why are those first steps so important? Well, first of all, they're never taught, or almost never taught. There's lots of books and online resources for toolkits, so specific methods you want to apply. But those textbooks essentially don't tell you when to choose such a toolkit, how to actually select these things. So focusing on the first steps essentially will set the stage, right? Essentially, they will force you in a certain way to specify what the precise question you're asking is. They will ensure you have thought your problem, your project through before you start getting lost in the details of modeling. And they will define a goal, which means that you know exactly when you will be done. Okay, so let's walk through a specific example together, and we will use that example essentially to illustrate those steps. So the first step is essentially thinking about the phenomenon and the question, right? So we will essentially have to define a particular objective, a goal, ask a particular question that will lead the whole modeling endeavor. And it all begins with a phenomenon that we want to explain, something that catches our curiosity, that is potentially unknown. And so for the sake of this particular teaching session, we will choose the train illusion. So the train illusion is a phenomenon that hopefully many of you have experienced. If you haven't experienced it, it's essentially the following. So you sit in a train, right? You look out the window. Next to you is another train. So the only thing you see out of the window is this other train. Okay. And then all of a sudden there is visual motion, right? So you experience that the train next to you is moving relative to your train, right? And the question essentially is, well, who's actually moving? Is it the other train departing, or is it your train departing? And so very often what happens is that you get the wrong idea. And after a certain while, you will essentially get surprised by the fact that, oh, I thought we were moving, but it was actually the train next to us that's moving, or vice versa. Okay. So why does this happen? Well, the phenomenon itself only happens if you experience the visual motion, the relative motion of that you see out of the window, right? So that's very important. And visual motion typically is sensed by sort of like the flow of information on your retina. Now, there's another important aspect, which is sort of like the sense of self motion, right? The sense of self motion, one important thing is that regardless of whether the train next to you is moving or your train is moving, the visual motion appears as exactly the same. So how does you disambiguate? Well, if you're moving, there is self motion. And the one way that the brain essentially detects self motion is through the vestibular organs, the inner ear organs that essentially sense the acceleration of our body with respect to gravity or inertia, essentially. And so this vestibular system essentially can sense that, but it is somewhat noisy. You can see there's a lot of variability in the sensed signals here. So this would be like a firing rate for a particular movement profile. Okay. Whereas the visual information is very or fairly accurate, but remember the visual information is the same regardless of whether we are moving or whether the train is actually moving. And one important other aspect of information is really this variability in the sensory information, right? So we have a very low threshold for detecting visual motion, for example, but the vestibular threshold for detecting acceleration is actually relatively high. And that is mostly because the noise, so the variability in the information that we receive from our sensory periphery is much higher for the vestibular input than for the visual input. And you can essentially experiment with that by simply trying to like balance on one leg, right? And then you close your eyes and try to balance again. You will see that it's much harder with your eyes closed once you take the much more accurate visual feedback away. And you can only rely on your inner ear organs for the balancing. Okay, so with that background information in mind, we can now look at how a group would approach this first step based on the train illusion and learn from some of their pitfalls. And then right after you essentially watch the group interaction, it'll be your turn to essentially ensure that you have a good question for your group project. Hello group, what's your project about?
A train illusion.
Cool, what's the question?
Well, we want to fit it with deep learning.
Whoa, that is not a question. Do you have an actual question in mind?
I'm not sure. It is just kind of puzzling, right?
So what exactly is puzzling about it? Why don't you formulate a question that captures what is puzzling?
Well, you see the train next door moving slowly at the station.
And it doesn't happen in cars. It only happens in trains or maybe airplanes, but it definitely doesn't happen in cars.
Right. And that's when it happens. And then it suddenly like you go back to the wheel movement. So the brain is wrong and then corrects itself.
Yeah, you feel like you're moving and then you're not. So maybe the question is kind of related to how we usually sense self motion, and the brain usually gets it right. Like usually we feel like we're moving and we're actually moving.
Yeah, we can totally make a deep learning model with this. So our question is, why do we sometimes have the illusion and sometimes not?
Okay, now that's somewhat unspecific, right? So what exactly do you want to achieve? What is your goal in this project? So why don't you do some reading to understand the state of the art and then list everything we already know? So it sounds like from what you just said that there's some bistable perception of self-motion. So what did you do? What did you learn from the literature? Are there any models of the train illusion that already exists? Or is there other work that has been done, for example, on self-motion perception?
We did some reading and we didn't find any models of the train illusion, but there were actually a lot of experiments that we saw on self-motion perception.
Oh, that's good. So what do those experiments look like?
Okay, well, so there's kind of two kinds. One kind only has like visual stuff, so like optic flow, like dots coming at you or something. And then the other ones, they put you on a chair and move you forward, backwards, or sideways mostly.
So yeah, it seemed like in a lot of the studies, they were giving you some visual information and also some vestibular information, like for your inner ears, so you feel like you're moving.
Yeah, so that would be important for the illusion, right?
How so?
I guess in the train illusion, the visual information is ambiguous. Like you can't tell whether you're moving or whether the train is moving just based on the visual information. So you must have to also use the vestibular information. But I remember it being really noisy, like really variable.
Okay, so with that knowledge, can you now formulate a better question?
So we could do something like, how do different combinations of visual and vestibular inputs lead to illusory self-motion?
Good, that's a much better question, but it still doesn't tell me what exactly you want to explain.
Right. It has to do with the sensory inputs, right?
So another thing I noticed is that if there's a vibration, you can tell that you're moving like really specifically, but on train tracks, you don't usually get that.
Right. So with that in mind, what is your goal?
It could be that to understand how the quality of the sensory input leads to the illusion.
Okay, great. So you can essentially integrate that goal into your question now, right? So if you were to do that, what would the question now sound like?
So before it was about how do different combinations of visual and vestibular inputs lead to the illusion, but now we got to have noise in there. So now it could be how do noisy visual and vestibular estimates of motion get combined by the brain to lead to illusory self-motion.
Awesome.